Hi everybody, welcome back to the second video in the Domestic Violence Awareness Month series. Today we are going to go through the power and control wheel. So you might have heard about the power and control wheel as it pertains to unhealthy or abusive relationships. And essentially the power and control wheel is just a tool that helps to explain different ways in which an abusive partner might behave. And let us go ahead and remember right now as well that when it comes to abuse, it is not always physical. Violence can also take the form of verbal, emotional, financial, manipulation, threats, and things like that. And because of this, it can be really difficult for a survivor to even realize that they're in an abusive situation if that abuse isn't happening physically. And so that's why it's so important to go over the power and control wheel today, because we want to make sure that we're aware of these things that are happening and that we're able to recognize if any red flags start to arise, and then figure out where to go from there. So again, using the power control wheel is a really good way that just helps us to understand a little bit better and recognize a little bit better the warning signs of abuse. And as you'll notice, I'll throw up the power and control wheel so that you can view it here as well. But as you'll notice, the spokes of the wheel represent a bunch of different behaviors like threatening, intimidation, coercion, and things like that that an abusive partner might use to instill fear in their partner, and that will help to manipulate them and create that sense of control. So it's also important to remember with power and control, and I know that we touched on this in the last video, but power and control is the main goal of an abuser. They want to feel that they are in charge. They want to feel that that what they say goes, and you'll see that happening a lot as we go throughout the spokes of the power and control wheel for the rest of the presentation. Okay, so when I'm talking about the power and control wheel, I want to make one more thing clear before I dive into it too much. But when there's a violent incident in an unhealthy relationship, more times than not, that violent behavior in that incident is going to be accompanied with an array of different types of abuse. So if there's a violent incident where the abuser is threatening to or actually following through with abusing a family pet, that's probably not the only thing that they're doing. They're also probably using coercion. They're also probably controlling financial situations and things like that. So I just mean to throw this part in here just so that we're understanding that that as I go through the spokes of the wheel, it's not a one and done situation. It is, a lot of these things can be tied in together, and it really just helps to establish that pattern of control and intimidation throughout the entire relationship, which ultimately makes all these other behaviors seem normal or like a lesser offense than any of the others. So with that, let's go ahead and go through the power and control wheel, and we're going to start with intimidation. So intimidation is a tactic that an abuser will try to use to make their partner feel afraid by any means possible. So they can do this through their body language. They could do this by smashing or destroying property, like I had mentioned, abusing family pets, and they could even use this as showing off a weapon as a form of a threat to make their partner afraid and ultimately comply with whatever it is that they are hoping that they will comply with. Abusive people really do thrive on feeling powerful and in charge of any situation, regardless of what means that takes. So another really common form of abuse is emotional abuse. And this is one of those forms that is often not easily identified by survivors because it's just so normal to them. But emotional abuse takes the form of constant put downs, name calling, the partner trying to convince them that they're just crazy or that they're the reason that the abuse is happening, for some reason that they had somehow brought on, or that they deserve it. The abuser will also start to deploy mind games. They'll make sure that they're instilling guilt and just otherwise trying to humiliate the partner. And so this is just a really common thing that happens, and the abuser will use whatever means necessary to get in their partner's head and to get inside their partner's head and to just make them feel that they're the ones who are at fault for feeling the way that they do, or for the abuse that's happening to them. And again, that just becomes so normal to the survivors because that's what they're constantly being met with, is that rhetoric. Next, we have isolation. This is another one that's really popular because this tactic allows the abuser to keep their partner away from any sort of support system that they might have. So that could be family, that could be friends, that could be work, things like that. So ultimately, isolation is when the abuser is completely controlling who the partner is allowed to see, who they're allowed to talk to, whether that be face-to-face, over the phone, texting, on social media, things like that. And the abuser just really uses this so that their partner has no place to go, nobody to confide in about any sort of abuse that is happening. And they will even use this tactic along with emotional abuse, because they'll tell the partner that they don't want them to see certain people because it makes them jealous, or that it hurts their feelings when they aren't spending enough time with them, or that they have too many responsibilities around the house that they couldn't possibly go out for dinner with a friend or things like that. So they really try to get inside their partner's head and make sure that that partner is right there with them and agreeing that that their abuser keeping them away from different situations and different people is a good thing and done out of love, when in reality it's just another form of control that abuser has over their partner. Next, we have minimizing, denying, and blaming. This tactic really gets in a survivor's head because the abuser tries to make light of the abuse and just otherwise make their partner feel crazy for the emotions that they feel as a consequence. So, for example, if the survivor tries to bring up their feelings or address the abuse that they're experiencing, they will instantly be met with excuses as to either why the survivor isn't remembering the story correctly, or how that didn't actually happen, or the reason that they did a certain thing is because the survivor just triggered them to do so by one of their behaviors or something that they said, or things along those lines. So in this situation, the abuser is really just going to focus on finding a way to blame their partner for the way that they acted. And this is seen a lot, and you might notice in some of our survivor stories that have either already come out or will be coming out throughout the remainder of the month, that there are abusers who will physically harm their partners because they're abusers, but they'll tell their partners it's because of them not liking what their partner had made them for dinner, or that they didn't like the way that they were talked to, or things like that. So they're really just trying to flip it back on their partners and the survivors any way that they possibly can. And another way that this is really shown, and also will show up in other social media posts as well, is the abuser will say that their behaviors are because they love their partners, or they will say, well, if you really loved me, you would ... fill in the blank. But let me just say this: if love is used as leverage or manipulation, it's not love. And that's something that I feel personally that everybody needs to hear, young and old, everybody alike, because the phrase "because I love you" has really become weaponized in abusive relationships. And that's why we need to make sure that we're spreading the message of what healthy love looks like and what unhealthy love looks like, so that we know what, first of all, what we want, and the boundaries that we'll set for ourselves, as well as what red flags to look out for, and when to intervene. Now let's talk about children. So children are a form of power and control because the abuser really can use them to get in their partner's head. So they can use the children to manipulate their partner. They can use the children as a reason to stay in the relationship. And a lot of times this is why survivors stay in abusive relationships, is because they either don't want the children to know that there's abuse happening, or they don't want to have to create a rip in the family and really mess with their schedules, or just otherwise affect them. But additionally, children are used in abusive relationships as a form of manipulation, because the abuser can use the children to relay messages to their partner, or they can start to make little comments that fall under emotional abuse that the children will start to believe or will repeat back to the survivor. And even if the survivor does split apart from their abuser, if their abuser still has rights to the children, they are able to use visitation as a way to harass and otherwise see and try to gain even more control over the survivor once again. And then finally, another way that children are used is as a pawn. The abuser will threaten to take away the children from the survivor. And regardless of whether they would even legally be able to do that, that gets inside the survivor's head, and that makes them stay because they don't want to be apart from their children, and rightfully so. So economic abuse is another really big part of power and control. And I'll circle back around to this point too, but economic abuse is also a really big reason that survivors might choose to stay in their abusive relationships. So let me explain a little bit what economic control can look like, and then we can come back to that thought. But economic control really just consists of the abuser controlling all finances and any sort of financial decisions that might come their way. And they might provide their partner with an allowance, or make them ask for money, and that often plays into the aspect of humiliation that we mentioned back in emotional abuse. They could also make them use any money that they do have to provide things like groceries or childcare or cleaning or things like that. So economic abuse can also be a tactic that abusers use to ensure that their partners aren't able to get jobs. And again, this one plays into isolation, as they don't want them outside of the house or doing anything where they could potentially cause any sort of trouble or disrupt their routine of being in power and in control of that situation and of that person. So like I said, this can be a reason that survivors stay in their relationship a lot longer than they should. And that's because finances are a really important part of getting away. And this is especially if the survivor doesn't have any friends or family to run off to, or to seek safe shelter for a little while. So the survivor might feel trapped without the funds to have a place to go. And this is also why domestic violence contributes so heavily to the problem of homelessness in our communities. And so again, this is just a really big thing that it exists, and there's a lot of factors that play into it, but it really can be part of a survivor's decision to stay in their situation. Next, we will discuss male privilege. So male privilege is something that's used to justify an abuser's actions. Oftentimes it really feeds into that king of the castle sort of mentality, and it really also is what defines gender roles within that relationship. So again, it could play into the aspect of men being the breadwinner, and that's why they might make their partner stay at home, or that's why they tell them that they're staying at home, is because they're going to go out and provide for the family while their partner takes of everything inside the house. Or they might, say that they are just super protective, and that's part of their gender role is to be the protector, and that's why they don't allow their partner to go out all by themselves or to talk to whoever they want to talk to or things like that. It really just is, male privilege really is just something that is used to define what the partner is and isn't allowed to do, and to give that justification when there's any sort of decision to be made, or any sort of expectation that they can say that society has, and things like that. Finally, we're going to discuss coercion and threats. So coercion and threats encompass behaviors such as making or even carrying out threats to harm their partner or their partner's family, or things like that. They could also threaten to leave their partner, or they could threaten to take children away, or to stop giving them money, or things like that. They could also say that they're going to hurt themselves if their partner even thinks about leaving them. And of course that plays into a lot of these other factors as well, such as emotional abuse, is because they do have a relationship together, regardless of whether that's healthy or unhealthy, but there's feelings there that would cause the survivor to make sure that they do whatever is in their power to keep their partner safe, regardless of whether or not that's reciprocated. Coercion and threats also is used as a vessel to get for the abuser to get their partner to join them in any sort of illegal activities, or use substances, or engage in sexual activity and things like that. And of course we know when it comes to using coercion and threats, especially in terms of sexual activity, coercion is not consent. So just to make that clear. But there's a lot that really does play into coercion and threats, because it can also cause the abuser to threaten their partner into not pressing charges against them if law enforcement does get involved, and things like that. So again, it really does play in to how there's so much going on, and how all of the abuse really can be tied together. For example, although certain acts are acts of coercion, it also plays into isolation or emotional abuse or things like that. Okay, so as you've now seen throughout this entire presentation, abuse can take many, many forms, and that includes forms that are not physical. But at its core, power and control are the reasons behind all of these things. And the behaviors exhibited by an abuser can feel subtle, or even like normal behaviors, or like everyday behaviors in the eyes of their survivor. And there's a saying that is helpful in understanding unhealthy relationships. If you put a frog in boiling water, it will jump right out. But if you put a frog in room temperature water, and then you gradually increase the temperature until boiling, the frog will stay there until it's boiled to death. And this really directly correlates to abusive relationships, because abusive relationships don't start out abusive. If they did, it would be a lot easier to recognize that and leave. But instead, abusive relationships start out happy and normal, just like any other relationship that you've probably ever had. So the abuse happens gradually, and it makes the partner used to the behaviors, and that's why they develop feelings for their abuser as well, and that causes them to feel empathetic and like it's their job just to deal with it. But I hope, as we've gone throughout this power and control wheel and kind of broke things down one by one, I hope that it's a little bit easier now to see and understand all the different facets of abuse so that we can really start to recognize the warning signs and make sure that we, for one, aren't contributing to them ourselves in our own relationships, but also that we're able to recognize them. But as a closing comment, I also want to just say abuse is not always physical. It takes many forms, as we've seen, as I've mentioned many times now, but I do mention it because it's really important to understand. As a closing comment today, I just want to say, remember that abuse takes many forms and it's not always physical. And I know I've said that over and over again throughout the entire presentation, but I do this because it's very important. And it's something, like I mentioned, it's something that is just expected, that an abusive relationship means that it's physically abusive. But there's a lot that goes into it. And oftentimes, all of these different facets of the power and control wheel happen hand in hand, and it's just so normal, and so it happens so gradually that we just don't understand that or realize it before it's too late. So I want to also point out that abuse is hard to recognize, and that's one of the reasons that a survivor might not leave their situation. But there's a lot of reasons why a survivor might not leave their situation, and I'll be sure to post a flyer that kind of goes into that a little bit more in depth, or even have a discussion about that even further if that's something that you would all like. But at the very least, I hope that this presentation opened up your eyes to recognize and that we can stand up for ourselves and for others. And of course, if you or someone you know is in need of assistance due to domestic violence, call our crisis office. We have people there 24/7 who are willing and able to help you, and that's what they're there for. So our number is 989-686-4551, or you can call us toll free at 1-800-834-2098. All right, I hope this presentation was useful for everybody, and if there's any questions, feel free to let us know. We'd love to come back and answer that for y'all. All right, have a good one.